After that, we have clergy like Richard Clifton down the road losing his position. You have the congregations who are supporting clergymen like him. They are voting with their feet. They are not coming to church. If their clergy are gone, they're not coming to church. So of course their names are being taken down and they're being punished. You can only do this for so long. You can only say, I'm not coming to church. You can only be fined so many times. If you're imprisoned and you still defy the king, it's getting serious. And we get to the point where the congregation here in Scooby and at Gainsborough feel that time is running out and they're going to have to leave England. This happens in 1607 and 1608. In the September of 1607, we have a planned escape from England. Because believe it or not, you couldn't just leave England if you wanted to. No, you had to have permission to pass port. You had to have permission from the government to leave the country. And if you were a dissident, you weren't going to get permission. And so we have our congregation planning to escape England. And what they do is they leave here. We're in Nottinghamshire, and because their nearest port is just down the road at Bawtry, there's a seagoing port in those days just a mile or two down the road. The problem is everybody would know folk like Brewster and the other villagers on site. It would be too dangerous. And once William Brewster had left the post, well, one of the duties of the post is seeing these messages and messengers forward. There was a time limit. If someone came along that Great Northern Road with a message that had to go to Scotland or to York, the postmaster had to see it's on its way very quickly. If William Brewster, as the postmaster, is suddenly not there, it would come to notice the authorities very quickly that something has happened at Scooby and there are a number of people missing. The first place will be the port there at Bawtry, and then at Hull. They'd be looking for these folk. So they were very clever. They decided that they'd go to Boston in Lincolnshire, which is about 60 miles that way. 60 miles. They would have to walk 60 miles with their children. Some of the wives had babes in arms. Can you imagine? You couldn't stop at a town each night because the searchers were after you. You would have to spend, and it would take 60 miles, at least a week to walk that far. 10 miles a day would be good going with children and all your belongings, maybe a little less. You couldn't stop in a town because you might be reported. You'd have to camp out in the cold, and it's September, and back then we were going through a little ice age, so it was a lot colder, the climate, than it is now. You're camping out in the rough. You can't even light a fire because someone might see it, and you don't know if the searchers are nearby looking for you. It must have been awful. It's the women I feel sorry for. Can you imagine trying to care for those children? You know, and you've got babies. How do you feed them? You can't even change a diaper, you know, a cloth, because you can't wash it out because you're on the run. But they get to Boston, and just outside Boston. Now, Boston's a strange town because the port isn't on the town. We have what we call a wash. It's an enormous sort of bay, and then there's the haven, which is a river, and then you have the town of Boston and the port. So they met the seaward side of the town, and the piece of land that they met on at a place called Fishtoft is absolutely barren. It's just flat. There's no trees. Well, there are a few, but they're all bent over from the wind. It's really inhospitable. So you can imagine the women trying to camp there while the men go into Boston and try to bribe a ship's captain to take them to Holland. That's dangerous enough. That's what the men do. They go into town and they arrange for a ship to pick them up. The ship doesn't come So you can imagine how worried the women are getting. In fact, it doesn't come until way past. They'd given up hope it was going to turn up. And when they do, can you imagine the relief of the women? Oh, thank God, no more out here in the wind and the rain. At last, we can be on our way to Holland. The children are going to be safe. We'll have some respite. But no sooner did they get on the ship than those rotten sailors get the women and push them to one side and the men to the other, and they start to accost them. They take the outer clothing of the men, all their coats, because they're valuable. They strip all the valuables of them. They take their belongings. They even rifle through the women's garments looking for money in their pockets. And pockets were like they were like pockets, but not sewn into your clothes. They were like little pouches on a string around your waist, under your skirts. And women didn't have underwear in those days. So imagine how humiliating it was to have these rough sailors searching you for money and belongings. And once they got everything of value, do you know what those sailors did? They turned everyone over to the authorities at Boston. And the men were thrown into prison. The women weren't. The women and children were thrown onto the street because women had no social standing. Women were just chattels. They belonged to their husbands. They had no mind of their own, so they were worthless. They weren't in prison. They were just thrown on the street to fend for themselves. And the men were in prison, we think, probably for around 6 weeks. Imagine the women. Their men are in that prison. Not only haven't they got food for the children, they're wondering if they're ever going to see their husbands again. When am I going to see them? Is it when they're going to be led off for execution? What's going to happen to us? It must have been so awful. Anyway, eventually the townspeople, they're quite sympathetic. There's a lot of people in that area with Puritan feelings. They're not going to go as far as be separatists, but they have a lot of sympathy for these folk. And they want to help them, but they can't. The town's elders have to send to the Privy Council in London to find out what to do with these wrongdoers. But information is very hard coming back. It takes a long time. In the end, it's said that the ringleaders, which include William Brewster, Richard Clifton, they are put in to a cart and taken to the assizes at Lincoln. The assize court is the serious county court. That's where the worst crimes are tried. And usually, if you're sent to the assizes, you know, it's not good. It's usually execution. So the ringleaders are sent to Lincoln, to the assizes. And strangely enough, they're set free. They're set free. They're told more or less to go back from where you came from and hand yourself in. You know, we're not judging you, we'll set you free. You go back, not our area, you go back, hand yourself in. It happens that the sheriff of Lincoln at that time was a chap called Gervase Helwys. He had a brother, Thomas Helwys, and Thomas Helwys was a member of the congregation of separatists at Gainsborough Old Hall. In fact, he would go to Holland, but later come back to England and form the very first Baptist church in London. So, our separatists have help. Well, they don't come back and hand themselves in. What's the point of coming back here? The bishop would know, the searchers would know they're going to be arrested, so somehow they hide out for the winter. They've lost all their possessions, their money, but somehow, by the next spring, they're ready to try to make a second escape attempt. This time, they go to Hull, the men. They bribe a ship from Hull to take them to Holland, and meanwhile, the women are walking along the Lincolnshire side of this great river we call the Humber. It's a great river. You've got Hull one side. They were going to meet on the Lincolnshire side of the border near a place called Immingham, and then the Humber comes out and you've got the North Sea and then Holland. So it's only a short trip to Holland. The women have arrived at their rendezvous point on the Humber on a barge. And the Humber is tidal, so you get seasick, and they've got little children with them. They're seasick, and they ask the bargeman to put them into the mouth of a creek because it would be sheltered, the water won't be so rough, and they can have a bit of break from the sickness. Meanwhile, the men have bribed a ship from Hull, and they are now coming around the Lincolnshire side along the Humber to meet the women. But the women have got there about a day early. Unfortunately, as the men start to near where the women are, the tide is wrong. And the mouth of this creek is all mud, and the barge is stuck in the creek. It can't get out. So they're going to have to wait for the tide to change. But the men who are along the coast can get onto the boat. And as the boat comes along, the men start to embark. So the first lot of men get onto the ship. But from the vantage point of being higher up on the ship, they suddenly are struck with horror because they can see the women caught in the barge, but further along they can see all the armed men coming with big billhooks, weapons, looming in on their women, about to arrest them. The ship's captain can also see this, and he knows that if those men can get to his ship, they will confiscate it and he will be in prison. To lose a ship as well, that would be terrible. So at that point he says, no. William Bradford writes, he shouts out an oath of his country. Sacramenti. Can't be a rude oath, or William Bradford wouldn't have written it down. So the Dutch captain takes off. He's only got half the men on board. There are still, the ringleaders are still ashore, because our separatists aren't like other Tudors. They like to see that the weakest go first and the strongest wait behind. So we've got some of the ringleaders here still ashore. They can see the women, but if they're caught, they're going to be arrested, game over. So they hide in the bushes. Nothing is actually going to happen to those women. They might be frightened. They might be manhandled a little bit as they're moved from place to place, but they're not in any real danger because they're only chattels. They're more of a nuisance to the authorities. The men are the prize, so they keep hidden and they help when they can. Meanwhile, the men on the ship, they have gone off down the Humber and they hit the North Sea, heading for Holland, when bang! The mother of all storms rises up, and they are blown all the way up to the coast of Norway. And yet, Holland end up in Norway. William Bradford writes, for days on end they didn't see the sun, the moon, the stars. That's because those separatist men were battened down below decks in the ship. The weather was so bad. They are down below decks and they're thinking, oh no, this is awful. Surely we're going to drown. Oh, do you know what's worse than that? If all the sailors are down there with you, because the sailors couldn't control the ship, the storm was so bad that they're below decks as well, and they're saying things like, we're all doomed, we're going to die. You can imagine the thoughts of everyone, and the ship going, tossing around, and Bradford says you could even feel the water coming in, because these old ships would leak. You could feel the water running through your mouth because it was coming in. And just when they thought they were absolutely doomed, the storm was at its highest. They're rolling like anything. And suddenly they pray in earnest, Lord, even now thou canst save us. Even now thou canst save us. And the storm abated. The storm calmed down. They got control of the ship. And they managed at last to make their way to Amsterdam, where they were headed. But there were hundreds of other ships wrecked in that same storm. It must have been almost a hurricane, looking at the records from that time, and how this one ship, this little ship, survived when they really thought all was lost is a miracle in its own. Yeah, they said that it was the Lord. They were convinced the Lord had saved them. It was a sign. The Lord had saved them. So there in Amsterdam, they meet up with the Gainsborough congregation who've managed to get away. And piecemeal, the men who are left behind have managed to get the women across to Holland as well. Because once the ship had gone, I expect all the bailiffs turned around and said, oh, yes, yeah, we saw the ship go, the men are on that. You know, the hue and cry was done. So eventually they're all reunited in Amsterdam. I was going to say, I know what that noise is, it's the clock. I can't compete with that. It's nice to hear that, yes. It's lovely. Quite pleasant.
Is it automatic?
It's not too bad, is it? Quite good though. Stop. That always happens when I'm giving a talk here, that happens.
So it go every hour?
Yeah, yes, every hour. So, you have our group in Holland, in Amsterdam. Richard Clifton is the leader of the group, but they're not there for long because there's a lot of friction. John Smith, who'd been the pastor in charge of the Separatist congregation at Gainsborough, he's a very volatile man, extremely volatile, very good preacher, but very volatile. And he's liable to change his ideas. He causes a lot of unrest with the Ancient Brethren. That is a church that's already established there in Amsterdam, of other expats who have escaped the country from time to time. They're established. There's hoo-ha between these. There's hoo-ha between the Scooby congregation not wanting to be caught up in all of this. So it comes to the point where the Scooby group decide, we are going to leave. And they get permission. You can't just go. You had to have permission to settle in Leiden. You had to have the city fathers. They had to give permission. And of course they knew Brewster. So he got permission for them to settle in Leiden. But at that point, Richard Clifton, now Bradford says of Richard Clifton, it was a shame that such an old man was harried out of his country. He describes Clifton as having a big, long, white beard, this poor old man harried out of his country. Clifton was in his 50s. I don't think I'd like to be described as an old man in my 50s, but, you know, they were in those days, you didn't live so long. And Clifton became of the mind that he was actually meant to stay behind in Amsterdam and try to help sort out the problems there. He knew some of the congregation in the Ancient Brethren. He wanted to try to be a peacemaker there. Besides, he was getting on. His wife was older. They had Robinson. So he amicably agreed that he wasn't going to go to Leiden. And so when our group go to Leiden, that's when Robinson becomes their spiritual head. And that's why he comes to the forefront. You know, a brilliant man. When the movement's just begun, he's still young. He's not that long out of Cambridge. But he becomes the mainstay of this group. And if you've read his works, you know, he's just a wonderful theologian. And that's how we have the group settling in Leiden and where Amsterdam comes in. So that's that part of the story.
Yeah.
Did you know this about the escapes?
No, we know that. We know that.
So it wasn't easy. Yes, so, you know, they go to Holland and it's going to be 12 years they're going to be in Holland. It's going to be 12 years, so it wasn't straight from England.
And after that, they moved back to England, right?
No,
Before.
they didn't move back to England.
Before they go to the New World?
They didn't move back to England, no. One person did come back to England. One person came back briefly because he was being hunted with a vengeance in Holland. And he thought the best place to hide would be under the nose of the English authorities, and that was Brewster. So we know that Brewster moved back to London very briefly before our group go. So Brewster actually hides out in England. Because while he's in Leyden, he's getting a terrible reputation because he has his own print. And what he does is he prints quite legal documents for the university, because both he and Robinson are part of the university in Leyden, but he also prints up a lot of things for the university, but he also prints up some of the pamphlets that are coming back to England, being smuggled in, which attacks, you know, the church in England, and saying why you should reform and all of this. And of course the king's not happy about that. And he does send agents over to Holland from time to try to capture Brewster, because he wants him silenced, he wants him brought back. And at the very end of his time in Holland, just before our group make for the New World, there is a particularly bad leaflet comes out, and it's all about the church in Scotland, which is another thorn for James. And this document this pamphlet is really stirring up bad feelings in Scotland against the king. So the king wants really to get Brewster for good. And the sad thing is, Brewster didn't print that at all, that leaflet. Someone borrowed his printing press. He didn't know that pamphlet was being printed, but of course they recognised a flaw in the print face, so they knew that it was his press. So he was the one being hunted for that. And he was very nearly caught, because he was in the university in Leyden when it was invaded by agents sent to arrest Brewster, and all the students started to shout, "Sanctuary!" because it was a law that nobody could judge anyone inside the university. It had its own autonomy, and they wanted to